A gifted chef vanishes, a rare pepper blend turns deadly, and in the quiet hush of Wolfe's brownstone, suspicion simmers like a sauce left too long on the stove. Only Nero Wolfe's formidable intellect can unravel the subtle layers of this culinary crime. Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's mystery. Where are you joining us from today? And what time is it for you, early morning or late at night? Wherever you are, pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let Archie Goodwin guide you through a case where flavor conceals fatal intent, and the truth, as always, must be served cold. It started with a breakfast that didn't happen, which, in our household, qualified as a seismic event. When I came downstairs that morning, expecting the familiar aroma of coffee and Fritz's cinnamon rolls with eggs Benedict on deck, I was instead greeted by a silence that felt almost accusatory. "Fritz?" I called into the kitchen, then into the pantry. No clinking pans, no brisk footsteps, no grumbling in Austrian-accented English about the lack of decent truffles in New York markets. Just a single, sullen mutter from the dining room. I found Fritz at the head of the table, not Wolfe's chair, of course, he wouldn't dare, but hunched slightly, arms folded. The table was set but untouched. A bowl of fruit looked abandoned. "I cannot serve the breakfast," he said, with a grim finality, usually reserved for funeral notices. I blinked. "Is this a hunger strike, Fritz? Or are you holding out for a ransom note?" He looked up, eyes wide. "The pepper." "Come again?" "The peperoncino di Calabria I received last week from Signor Corletti. It's tainted." That stopped me. Fritz didn't rattle easily, certainly not over seasoning. "I opened the jar this morning. The smell, there was something off. Not spoiled, more metallic." He almost whispered the last word. I didn't laugh, mostly because he looked like a man who had just stepped back from the edge of some great culinary abyss, and also because I knew what was coming. Fritz lowered his voice. "I cannot in good conscience serve anything until we know." Wolfe wouldn't like this. Wolfe didn't like disruptions. And this was the kind of disruption that could rattle the breakfast tray straight off its moorings. And, like clockwork, the thunder from above. "Archie!" Wolfe's voice bellowed. "Explain this lunacy!" So began our descent into spices, scandal, and something far more dangerous than a ruined omelette. It took precisely 28 seconds of explanation before Wolfe declared Fritz's fears a fit of culinary melodrama and called the pepper innocent until proven guilty. Fritz didn't flinch, which was saying something. He placed the small glass jar, no label, only a handwritten sticker marked Calabrian Reserve, on Wolfe's desk like a piece of evidence submitted for trial. "I received it 6 days ago," Fritz said, "from Chef Gianni Corletti." "Who?" Wolfe asked, folding his arms. "An Italian," I offered. "Owns Corletti's trattoria down in Soho. Rising star, bit of a flavor chemist, apparently." Fritz nodded. He sent it with a handwritten note, called it his definitive blend, said it would change how I understood heat. Wolfe's expression didn't budge. "And did it?" "I don't know, I haven't used it." I picked up the jar. The seal was intact, the pepper flakes a deep rust red, bordering on burgundy. I unscrewed the lid and took a cautious sniff. Wolfe raised a brow. "Well?" "Fritz has a point. Smells sharp, not just hot. There's a kind of tang, like tin, maybe." Wolfe didn't reply. He leaned back in his chair and tapped a thick index finger against the armrest. "Chef Corletti," he repeated. "Yes, sir," Fritz said. "And now he's unreachable. I tried to thank him. The restaurant's phone goes unanswered." Wolfe exhaled, annoyed. "You suspect foul play in a spice jar?" "I suspect something is wrong," Fritz replied evenly. The chef would not ignore a gift's reception. Wolfe finally looked at me. "Archie, go sniff around. I won't have this house paralyzed over paprika." "It's not paprika," Fritz said sternly. "It's—" Yes, Wolfe waved. "Whatever it is, it's your responsibility now, Archie." Just like that, I had been assigned to track down a pepper-flavored enigma, one that, for all I knew, had already claimed its first victim. Gianni Corletti's trattoria looked as if it had been left mid-breath. Chairs still arranged around linen-cloaked tables, cutlery wrapped in napkins, and a chalkboard outside, promising pasta alla calabrese, but the doors were locked, the windows shuttered, and not a soul in sight. A neighbouring florist peered over her buckets of marigolds when I loitered too long by the door. "You looking for the chef?" she asked. "That obvious?" She shrugged. "You're the third one this week. First a woman with a notebook, then a man who looked like he'd sweat through a court summons." "Corletti around?" "Not for days. Walked out Tuesday night. Dinner service half done. Never came back." "And the staff?" "Locked out, same as you. One of the waiters said he heard shouting in the kitchen before the chef left." "Shouting?" She nodded. Then silence, then nothing. Back in Manhattan, I tracked down Rinaldo Marini, the sous chef. A square-jawed man with eyes like burnt espresso, he answered the door with flour on his apron and nerves in his smile. "He's dramatic," Marini said of his employer. But this time, it wasn't just drama. "Go on." "He'd been working on something," he said, lowering his voice. "A signature pepper blend. Claimed it would make his name across 2 continents. Said it was hot, but not crude. Complex. Layered." "Sounds like marketing?" Marini didn't smile. He stopped letting me taste it. That was telling. Later, I caught up with Marta De Luca, a rival restaurateur known for knives both real and metaphorical. She was less cautious. "Gianni accused me of stealing his ideas," she said, lighting a clove cigarette in her office. "As if I'd stooped to theft. I can outcook that boy in my sleep." "Any hard feelings?" She exhaled smoke in a perfect ring. "Only when men let spices go to their heads." By the time I returned to the brownstone, I had 3 things: a locked restaurant, a paranoid sous chef, and a rival with motive and ego to spare. I also had a spice jar with an aftertaste Wolfe couldn't ignore, though he'd pretend he still could, which meant it was time to bring in Saul. Because if Corletti was missing, and that pepper was truly poisoned, then the next course in this meal was murder. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of Corletti's trattoria, which looked about as open for business as a mausoleum on a Monday. The blinds were drawn, the door was bolted, and a tasteful closed-for-maintenance card had been slid behind the glass, clearly intended to soothe loyal diners, none of whom seemed to be loitering for reservations. What wasn't tasteful was the gossip I got from a guy across the street hauling produce. According to him, the chef had walked out halfway through plating a halibut special and never walked back in. "No warning?" I asked, eyeing a crate of bruised tomatoes. "Just the back door swinging," he said. "Heard he had some blow-up in the kitchen. Sounded like a pan hitting a wall." A kitchen tantrum isn't rare in that world, but ghosting mid-service? That smelled more suspicious than spoiled scallops. After some mild coaxing and a 20 slipped to the dishwasher on duty 2 nights earlier, I got an informal account. Corletti had been irritable for weeks, possessive of a new ingredient he'd been developing, protective of the storage room. Then snap, he was gone. No word, no calls, no goodbyes. I called Wolfe from a payphone 3 blocks away. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was paying attention. "He left his restaurant in the middle of service," I reported. "Locked the staff out, no sightings since." Silence. Then, "Continue." Which was Wolfe's way of saying, "I still don't care, but I might care if you keep talking," so I did. Next stop. The chef's second-in-command, who might have known whether Corletti fled from failure or something that had his tongue burning for a reason other than spice. Rinaldo Marini opened his door with the wary expression of a man who thought I might be a process server. He was shorter than I expected, broad-shouldered and squared off like a butcher block, and he smelled like flour, onions, and anxiety. "You knew Corletti better than most," I said, showing him my card. "I'm not a cop. I just ask questions for a man who likes answers." He let me in reluctantly. The apartment was modest, nicer than some, worse than others, and he offered me coffee without the slightest intention of actually making any. a man after my own efficiency. He was intense, Rinaldo said. But good. Better than me. He lived for his food. Lately, though, I don't know, he was obsessed. With what? Rinaldo hesitated. A new pepper blend. He called it his masterpiece. Wouldn't even let me into the pantry once he had it. He say where he got it? Number, he just started working with this new importer. Said it was top-grade Calabrian. But it wasn't just about the heat. He said it had character. That it had to be handled like truffle oil. Subtle, measured. Or else. Or else what? He didn't say, just looked like he hadn't slept in days. I made a few notes, mostly to appear professional. But the part about Corletti guarding the pepper like it was the formula for Coca-Cola, that was real. You think he left on his own? I asked. Rinaldo shook his head. He might have walked out, but he didn't leave. Not like that. I stood, thanked him, and walked back to the curb with a thought already forming. If Corletti had vanished into the night, someone might have nudged him into it. And maybe, just maybe, the pepper had something to say about it. Marta De Luca didn't keep me waiting. She swept into her office like she owned it, and probably did, dressed in chef whites with embroidery that looked like it cost more than my car. I knew Gianni would attract drama, she said, before I'd finished introducing myself. That's what happens when a boy plays with fire and calls it cuisine. Interesting, I heard he accused you of stealing. She smiled. It didn't touch her eyes. He did. Said I'd copied his saffron risotto, which, between you and me, I was making before he learned to pronounce arborio. You seem remarkably calm, considering he's missing. Her hand froze mid-reach for a cigarette. Missing? I nodded. Since Tuesday, walked out of his kitchen mid-service. She lit the cigarette anyway. Not the first tantrum he's thrown, but possibly the last, I said. Fritz Brenner received a pepper blend from him. It didn't smell right. Metallic, almost toxic. Marta exhaled a perfect stream of smoke. If Gianni started poisoning people, it wouldn't surprise me. He was desperate to be seen as genius. Some men would rather be infamous than forgotten. Any chance he sent you a sample? She laughed. He wouldn't dare. I criticized his palate once. He sulked for a month. I leaned forward. What was he afraid of losing? She thought for a second. His name? His flavor? You could tell he was holding on to something he thought made him special. That, I thought, was often the motive behind secrets, and sometimes behind murders. Back at the brownstone, I filed my notes while Fritz hovered nearby, anxious to know what I'd uncovered. Wolfe merely asked, "Is he dead?" "I don't know," I replied. "But if he's not, he's hiding from someone with a better recipe, and a better reason to see him disappear." And Wolfe, finally, looked interested. When Wolfe says, "Bring in Saul," he doesn't need to explain. It's a bit like saying, "Call in the surgeon," after diagnosing something malignant. Saul Panzer operates with the precision of a scalpel, only far more quietly and with better posture. I found Saul outside a tailor's on Madison, examining a button on his cuff as though it were part of a surveillance rig. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the scene: missing chef, erratic behavior, volatile pepper blend, suspicious associates. "Financials?" he asked finally. Wolfe's idea wants to know if Corletti had debts, enemies, investments, or mistresses, not necessarily in that order. Saul nodded. "Give me 48. Make it 24. Fritz hasn't cooked in 2 days. We're eating reheated pot roast." That got a rare grin. Wolfe might prefer murder to culinary mutiny. Right now, he'd prefer resolution, or a menu. Saul vanished the way he always does, without saying goodbye or opening a door. I had no doubt he'd surface with something valuable, whether from a banker or a busboy. That was Saul's genius. He knew where to look before he asked where something had gone. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was knee-deep in botanical texts and muttering about alkaloid chains. Fritz hovered in the hallway like a ghost in an apron. Did you reach him? Wolfe asked. He's on it. Good, Wolfe said, not looking up. Because this pepper has more than flavour, it has intent. And, for Wolfe, intent was the beginning of murder. The next morning, armed with Saul's silence and Wolfe's vague displeasure, I headed back to Corletti's apartment. Getting in wasn't difficult. A modest tip to the building superintendent, along with the flash of my license, granted me all the access I needed. The apartment smelled faintly of garlic and ambition. I found a spice rack in the kitchen that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit, the obsessive chef in his natural habitat. Neat rows, uniform labels, except for the top shelf. That's where it got interesting. There were 3 glass jars, all identical in shape but not in description. One said Reserve Blend, Calabrese. Another had Experimental Lot Number 12. The third bore a sleek black sticker that simply read Veritas, Latin for truth. Dramatic, but not illegal. I removed all 3, laid them out, and studied the distributor codes inked in microscopic print on the undersides of the lids. All were supposedly from the same importer, Trent Artisan Spices, Brooklyn, but the lot numbers didn't match. One had a trailing digit scratched off, the ink faded. Another bore a completely different font, thinner and cheaper looking. That set off bells. I bagged the jars, don't ask where the bags came from, I'm always prepared, and took them back to the brownstone. Wolfe didn't rise from his chair when I placed them on his desk, but his eyebrows did. There's inconsistency, I said. Same origin, different batches, different branding, possibly forged. Wolfe plucked the Veritas jar from the group. He turned it once, twice, then unscrewed the lid. The smell reached me before he spoke, a fusion of smoked earth, bitter citrus, and something sharper, almost sterile.
Aha, Wolfe said softly. The chef was tampering with purity. With what? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Not seasoning, secrecy. I didn't press. Wolfe was in deduction mode, and interrupting that would earn me an hour of verbal labour. But I knew this much. Something in those jars was worse than mislabeling. Something in them had teeth. Wolfe sat motionless with the jar under his nose, as though he could read its contents like scripture. He closed the lid, set it down gently, and leaned back in his chair with his fingertips touching. It's the carrier, he said. The what? The compound that carries the heat. Most peppers derive their pungency from capsaicinoids. But this blend contains an alkaloid I do not recognize, or rather, I do, but not from cuisine. I waited. Wolfe didn't fill silences out of politeness. I believe this was altered, he said at last. Engineered? Not by a spice merchant, but by someone with knowledge of chemical interaction. Poison? Possibly, Wolfe said. Certainly capable of harm, perhaps not enough to kill outright, but with repetition. Yes. Fritz, who had crept in unannounced, let out a breath that was almost a sob. Wolfe turned to him. You did well not to use it, he said. Fritz's face didn't change, but I noticed his spine straightened by half an inch. Archie, Wolfe said, inform Saul that we are now hunting an origin, not just a motive. And if the origin doesn't want to be found? Wolfe gave me a look as dry as old parchment. Then we will offer them the opportunity to confess, before the seasoning of justice become too bold. It was a Thursday, and the weather had taken on that springtime indecision, half-hearted sunshine trying to break through clouds that clearly had other plans. I had just returned from a lackluster errand involving Basil and a bookstore when the phone rang with the clarity only bad news brings. Wolfe answered it himself, which already set my internal barometer twitching. Yes, he said. Then? When? Then, after a pause, send the report here. He hung up and turned toward me, which is always a gesture that comes with strings attached. Gianni Corletti has been found, he said. Alive or otherwise? Otherwise. According to the brief account from Saul, who had the connections to retrieve such things before the ink dried, Corletti had been discovered that morning in his apartment.
The body was found slumped near the kitchen. The official verdict, at least preliminarily, was accidental ingestion of an alkaloid compound traced back to a spice. More specifically, pepper. I gave Wolfe a long look. So Fritz wasn't imagining things. He rarely does, Wolfe said curtly. The details were sparse, but the picture was vivid enough. A man obsessed with flavor who'd managed to cook his last dish. Saul, in his usual efficiency, had already acquired a copy of the coroner's preliminary, foaming at the mouth, no signs of external trauma, no alcohol, only traces of solanaceous derivatives, a family that includes deadly nightshade when you want your poisoning to have pedigree. Wolfe steepled his fingers. He made the blend, or tampered with it, and now he's paid the price. Suicide? Wolfe shook his head slowly. Number. He had too much pride for that. And plans. Remember Saul's note. He was preparing to launch a new venture, which someone might have preferred he didn't. Precisely. I glanced toward the hallway where Fritz was still trying to pretend he wasn't eavesdropping. The man's entire sense of order was built around the sanctity of food. The idea that his kitchen had come so close to becoming a crime scene wasn't just unsettling, it was personal. And we were only beginning to understand how personal it would become. The full report arrived the next morning, hand-delivered by a courier who looked slightly unnerved by the building. Fritz took the envelope with the kind of delicacy most reserved for relics, and Wolfe opened it with the tip of a letter opener that had seen more dramatic moments. As expected, the toxicology report confirmed what Saul had already told us, an exotic alkaloid compound consistent with a specific subspecies of Capsicum chinense, a notoriously volatile strain known to produce unpredictable reactions depending on dosage and preparation. What wasn't expected, at least to the layman, was Wolfe's reaction. He read the report once, then again, then grunted. Amateurs, he said. Medical examiners? Number whoever did this. Sloppy execution. I raised an eyebrow. You're critiquing a murder like a bad soufflé? Wolfe ignored me. This wasn't a clean dose. The concentrations were inconsistent, which implies intent, but not experience. He pushed the report away like an overcooked steak. He was meant to suffer, not to die cleanly. Which suggests what? A warning? Wolfe nodded. And a mistake. They underestimated the volatility of the compound. It reacted more violently than intended. I sat down across from him. So someone was trying to scare him off? Possibly, Wolfe said. Or simply silence him in a way that would appear natural. Death by ambition. But they didn't anticipate the body being found so soon, or the compound leaving such a distinct signature. Which means... Wolfe reached for the spice jars still resting on the edge of his desk. It means the murderer is not a chemist, but they are someone with access and motive. And if they've used the blend before, then we find who else has tasted fire and lived to talk about it. Fritz came into the office that evening without knocking, which would have earned most people a sharp rebuke from Wolfe. But Wolfe merely looked up and waited. I wish to confess, Fritz said softly. Confession implies wrongdoing, Wolfe said. Proceed. Fritz placed a white cloth napkin on the corner of the desk and stood with both hands clasped behind his back like a soldier delivering bad news. 3 nights ago, he said, I prepared a mushroom risotto with the intention of using the new pepper. From Corletti? Yes, the gift. He glanced at me, then back to Wolfe. As I was about to season the pan, I hesitated. Something about the scent struck me, sharp, metallic. I thought perhaps the jar had spoiled, or was improperly stored. I set it aside and replaced it with another blend. You didn't mention this, I said. I didn't think it mattered, Fritz replied, eyes hard with guilt. Until now. Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly. You were about to serve it to me? Yes. And your instinct stopped you? I believe so. There was a pause. Then Wolfe said, You may return to the kitchen. Fritz didn't move. You are not dismissed, Wolfe added. You are commended. There is a difference. The look on Fritz's face might have passed for pride or relief. Either way, it was rare. After he left, Wolfe turned to me. Had he used it, I'd be in the morgue. Or worse, the hospital. I replied, "You'd hate the food." He didn't smile. "Number, I'd hate the incompetence." When Wolfe truly wants answers, he retreats, not with dramatics, but with the slow inevitability of an eclipse. After Fritz's confession, he issued one of his rare decrees: no interruptions, save for news of war, fire, or the arrival of death in a bowler hat. Then he vanished into the plant room with a crate of spice journals and texts that hadn't seen daylight since Truman was president. I knew better than to poke the bear, so I limited my involvement to what Wolfe calls menial intrusions of necessity: answering calls, collecting mail, and making coffee Wolfe wouldn't drink. From the occasional murmur drifting down the stairs, capsicum frutescens, scovilloid instability, bifurcated alkaloid exposure, I could tell he was circling something. He wasn't reading to confirm a theory, he was reading to construct one. 3 hours in, he emerged, clutching a slender volume with a cracked binding and a title that looked like it had been typeset by candlelight. He didn't speak right away, which meant he was either composing a monologue or deeply disturbed, possibly both. At last he said, "There's a compound, solanidine, naturally occurring in nightshade peppers. In small, controlled doses, it produces heat and flavor. In excess, it causes cardiac arrhythmia, hallucinations, and, with sustained exposure, death. And our friend Corletti was experimenting, and someone, either through incompetence or malice, tampered with his ratios. So we're not just looking for a murderer, we're looking for a chemist." "No," Wolfe said, "we are looking for someone who thinks they are one." "And when we find them?" He gave a thin smile. "We offer them the opportunity to explain their culinary philosophy. Under scrutiny." Before I could respond, the phone rang. Wolfe ignored it. I answered. It was Saul. "Found your investor," he said. "You'll want to hear this." And just like that, the mystery got a new ingredient. When Saul says, "You'll want to hear this," it's generally a preamble to something worth listening to. He doesn't embellish, doesn't speculate, just hands you the blueprint and waits for you to notice the flaw in the architecture. Corletti was preparing to launch a private label, Saul said, a full-blown spice brand, trademark filed under his name last month, with the blend registered as proprietary, called it Veritas Wolfe, now seated with his boots anchored to the footrest and a steely glint in his eye, nodded once. "Continue." He needed capital, had a silent partner, documents filed through a dummy corporation in Delaware, but the funds came from an account connected to Veronica K. I whistled low. "The food critic?" Saul confirmed it. "Same. Publicly, she's just a columnist, but she has hidden investments in at least 3 Manhattan restaurants, including one owned by Marta DeLuca." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Which means her review power becomes financially leveraged." "Exactly," Saul said. "She was bankrolling Corletti's new venture, under the table. No one knew. But if that pepper blend went public, so would the connection. And there's more." He paused, which wasn't like Saul unless the next bit needed its own breath. "She filed a cease order 3 days before Corletti vanished." Wolfe sat forward. "On what grounds?" "Breach of verbal contract. He was going to cut her out and take the product to a second distributor." "So she had motive," I said. "Financial, reputational." Wolfe tapped the desk once. She also had access, likely handled the product herself, possibly even suggested its composition. Saul added, "She wrote a glowing review of his risotto calabrese 3 weeks ago, said it had a fire unlike any she'd ever tasted." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "And now we know whose fire she feared being burned by." I'd met Veronica K. before, once at a culinary award dinner where she wore an emerald dress and the expression of someone mildly annoyed by applause. She had that rare brand of charm that feels entirely fabricated but is so well rehearsed, you almost admire the craft. When she arrived at the brownstone, invited under the guise of consultation, she carried herself like royalty summoned to inspect the servants. "I assume this is about Corletti," she said, taking the chair Wolfe had pointed to but not acknowledged. What a tragedy. So much promise extinguished. Wolfe didn't rise. Indeed. Tell me, Miss Kay, when did you last taste his signature blend? She blinked, just once. But it was enough. I'm a food critic. I taste many things. Yet you wrote, in your last published review, that his risotto had a heat that sang without screaming, and a finish like smoke over steel. Curious phrasing, she smiled. Poetic license? Or proprietary knowledge? She stiffened, just slightly. If you're implying I had any stake in his business, I suggest you speak to my attorney. I have, Wolfe said, though under another name. That got her. I can't be implicated in what I didn't do, she said. If Gianni mishandled his own product. He didn't mishandle it, Wolfe said. You did. In attempting to warn him off his independence, you fatally overstepped your chemistry. I watched the colour in her cheeks dim just a notch. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was as close as we were likely to get without leverage. And Wolfe had no intention of letting that opportunity go uncooked. Wolfe let her sit in silence long enough for the ticking clock to become audible. Then he reached into the drawer beside him and withdrew a printed copy of her latest column. May I? He asked, not waiting for permission. He read aloud. The risotto arrived humble in presentation, but possessed a heat I've not encountered before, layered, disorienting, with a finish that clung to memory long after the meal. He folded the page. That dish was prepared on the same evening Corletti vanished, and it was the only one on the menu that used the Veritas blend exclusively. Veronica looked unimpressed. That proves nothing. It proves you consumed it prior to his disappearance, Wolfe said, which means you had access before it was finalized, which means, by legal logic and culinary deduction, you had both motive and opportunity. You can't prove I doctored anything. No, Wolfe said, but I don't need to. The pepper will. She frowned. There is enough left of the batch to test for chemical irregularities, trace compounds consistent with synthetic modification, and given your other culinary investments, I imagine you'd prefer discretion to headlines. That finally did it. She folded her arms, glanced once toward the door, and then gave Wolfe a long, unreadable look. I didn't mean to kill him, she said, only slow him down. Ah, Wolfe said, almost tenderly. A pity, for once, someone seasoned ambition too well. I've hosted many a gathering at the Brownstone, clients trembling in their overcoats, suspects posturing through martinis, but rarely have I presided over a luncheon quite so tightly, seasoned with tension. Wolfe called it a controlled convergence. I called it a recipe for combustion. The guest list read like a menu of motive. Marta De Luca, playing the cool restaurateur with a crocodile smile. Rinaldo Marini, arms crossed and twitching like he'd rather be anywhere else. Lowell Trent, spice importer with the conversational skills of a tax form, and the ever-composed Veronica Kay, wearing a dress sharper than her tone. Wolfe didn't attend, of course. He remained in the office, allegedly doing something essential with Orchid Root Systems, which left me to play maitre d', referee, and the sole barrier between passive aggression and something you might actually need napkins for. Fritz, with a solemnity usually reserved for funerals, served 3 small plates per guest. Each dish had been prepared with one of the questionable pepper jars. The idea, as Wolfe put it, was to induce memory, not digestion. As the plates were placed and forks raised, the pleasantries began, if you can call them that. So you're the one importing poison now? Marta asked Lowell, sipping her wine like it was a truth serum. I import spices, Lowell replied stiffly. What you do with them is your culinary burden. Rinaldo stabbed a roasted potato. Maybe if some people kept recipes in their kitchens instead of safe deposit boxes, chefs wouldn't disappear. Oh, do grow up, Veronica murmured. You're not even in his will. I had to give it to them. If Wolfe had been watching, he'd have appreciated the theatre. Everyone was acting, but none of them seemed to be reading from the same script. I made casual notes as I refilled water and wine. Marta barely touched her plate. Lowell sniffed every item before eating, which didn't exactly scream innocence. Veronica ate methodically, too methodically. Rinaldo cleaned his plate like a man proving something. I gave Wolfe the rundown afterward. He said nothing for a moment, then asked, "Who declined the second serving?" "Marta." "Good, bring her in last tomorrow." "Why?" "Because the others will need time to panic." Wolfe detests public performance, but he appreciates private theatre. The tasting, as expected, had delivered no confessions but several cracks, hairline fractures in the composure of those who believed themselves immune to scrutiny. I delivered the reports while Wolfe sat behind his desk, sipping beer and thumbing through a spice catalogue like it might conceal a murder weapon. "I noticed something," I said. "They all assumed we knew more than we do." "That's how guilt speaks," Wolfe murmured. "It assumes observation is accusation." He asked for details. Who flinched at which question? Who reached for salt instead of pepper? Who dabbed their mouths but not their foreheads? Veronica, I told him, had eaten slowly but deliberately. She spoke the least. Marta played offence. Lowell deflected. Rinaldo barked and bristled. "And which one," Wolfe asked, "tried to redirect the conversation more than once?" "Veronica." Wolfe closed the catalogue. "That confirms it." "Confirms what?" "That she knows we're close." Fritz entered to retrieve the untouched plates Wolfe had insisted be laid out in the dining room. Presentation, apparently, was crucial to ambiance, even if the audience was mostly suspicion. "She asked to take her wine glass," I said. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Curious?" "I told her no, said I'd have it cleaned." "Excellent. Have Saul run a test. Lipstick is harmless, trace agents are not." I nodded. "You think she spiked it herself?" "No," Wolfe said. "But I think she feared it might have been." And that, coming from Nero Wolfe, was as close to a scent trail as blood on a butcher's apron. Saul returned the following morning, precisely on time and completely unbothered by the notion that his findings might shake the table. That's his way. He drops bombs like most men drop teaspoons. "She's deeper in than we thought," he said, taking the straight-backed chair across from Wolfe's desk. "Veronica K. isn't just reviewing Marta DeLuca's food, she's bankrolling it." Wolfe's gaze didn't shift, but I saw his right eyebrow perform a modest elevation. "Details," he said. Saul handed over a file. "Shell Corporation registered in Nevada. Owner, K Holdings, LLC. It holds a 30% silent stake in Marta's main restaurant, Saffron. She's been investing for nearly 2 years. "That's not just business," I said. "That's leverage." "Exactly," Saul replied. "And here's the spice rub. Marta didn't know the full extent of the investment. She believed Veronica's involvement was short-term and purely promotional." Wolfe tapped the file once, as if to test its density. "Meaning Veronica had reason to keep Marta in check." "And Corletti was going independent," I added, "with a blend that would compete with whatever Marta was using and potentially expose Veronica's influence." Saul nodded. "Corletti was on the verge of launching Veritas nationally, had a meeting with distributors lined up for the following week. That meeting never happened. Fritz entered to collect Wolfe's breakfast tray and paused. He doesn't eavesdrop exactly, but he makes a profession out of lingering with dignity." Wolfe looked toward him, then back to Saul. "She feared exposure, both literal and reputational, and if Corletti had succeeded—" "She'd lose her control," Saul finished. "And her critics," I added, "might start reviewing her." Wolfe closed the file. "We'll summon Ms. DeLuca again, but this time with the proper pepper jar placed squarely in view." Lowell Trent wasn't the kind of man who invited trust. His voice had the timbre of a corporate training video, and his handshake felt like a damp linen napkin. Still, he agreed, under minimal protest, to let Saul and me inspect his warehouse in Queens. It smelled like spice heaven and liability hell. Wooden crates stacked to the rafters, each stamped with elegant logos designed to assure customers of quality and exotic sourcing. The floor manager, a man named Reuben who looked like he'd been sniffing turmeric since 1993, guided us through the rows. We've got inventory controls. You're not going to find anything off, he said. We're not looking for off, I replied. We're looking for odd. There's a difference. 10 minutes in, Saul tapped a crate labelled Calabrian Blend B42. The numbering was familiar, but the sticker font wasn't. He opened the crate and retrieved a jar, glass, elegant, with a faint maroon tinge to the pepper inside. The label read Trent Signature Spice Reserve, with a batch number that matched Fritz's jar almost exactly, except for one detail. The distributor code was a different typeface, slightly compressed. Forgery? I asked. No, Saul said, examining it. Just sloppy. The warehouse manager looked confused. Oh, that's a standard batch. Not quite, Saul muttered. Standard wouldn't include double-coated seals. This was repackaged. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe gave the jar a cursory inspection, then a second, more prolonged one. He unscrewed the lid and sniffed, once, sharply. Then he replaced it with a soft grunt that I'd come to interpret as disappointment laced with confirmation. Someone has tampered with the supply chain, he said. You sure? Yes. The scent profile is too clean. Someone scrubbed it, probably masked the active agents with vinegar smoke and rosemary oil. Why vinegar smoke? It evaporates, leaves no trace after 24 hours. Saul nodded. So Veronica could have introduced a doctored jar into the supply line, disguised it, and blamed the blend itself if something went wrong. And something did, Wolfe said. I added, then the mislabeled jars were a trap. No, Wolfe said, they were a mirror, meant to reflect guilt in the wrong direction. I didn't know about the rest, but I knew one thing. This case had more flavor than anything Wolfe had tasted in weeks, and he wasn't going to let it go bland. If Saul Panzer had a hobby, it would be walking in on people at the precise moment they're about to do something they'll wish they hadn't. That's how he found Rinaldo Marini, mid-snoop in Corletti's personal office, elbow deep in a locked filing cabinet. He claimed he was retrieving a copy of a shared risotto variation, Saul told us later, with the tone of a man quoting an opera libretto written by a fifth grader. Did he have a key? I asked. No, Saul replied. Used a flathead knife. Not especially discreet. We brought Rinaldo to the brownstone that evening, not under arrest, just under pressure. He sat in Wolfe's office with the unease of a man who hadn't been invited to dinner and suspected he might be the main course. I worked under Gianni for 5 years, Rinaldo said. I helped build that menu. He promised me a cut of the spice blend if it launched. And when it didn't launch, I said, you decided to take what was yours. I only wanted what I helped create. You wanted the blend, Wolfe said softly. Or the recipe. Same thing. No, Mr. Marini, Wolfe replied. A recipe is memory. A blend is proof. Rinaldo shifted. He didn't trust anyone, not even me. That, Wolfe said, might have been the only wise decision he made. We had no evidence Rinaldo had tampered with the pepper. But we did have motive, opportunity, and an unlocked drawer now missing a few pages. He's a distraction, Wolfe said after the man left. A thief of flavor, not a killer. Still, I said, he wanted the blend bad enough to break a lock. And others, Wolfe murmured, wanted it bad enough to break a man. Wolfe summoned me to his desk after breakfast, which in our world often signifies either a brewing confrontation or a task requiring shoe leather. This time, it was the latter. Trace the origin of this, he said, sliding a jar across the desk. It was one of the Veritas jars, identical to the one Fritz had set aside, down to the half-torn sticker on the underside. Specifically? I asked. Distributor number, I want the original supplier, not the importer, not the handler, the source. Got it. I spent the better part of the afternoon wading through invoices, cross-referencing batch numbers, and calling every spice wholesaler from Chelsea Market to the Bronx. The break came via a woman named Thelma, who ran shipping logistics at Vittorio & Sons, a modest but meticulous outfit with a reputation for uncut imports. We don't ship under the name Veritas, she said, when I gave her the code. That was routed through DeLuca's preferred distributor, Mistral Foods. We send them unprocessed Calabrian bulk. What they do with it? That's not our concern. Back at the brownstone, I laid it out for Wolfe. Marta DeLuca's supplier, Mistral, was the only point of contact capable of modifying or repackaging the pepper before it reached Corletti. Meaning, I concluded, whoever doctored it did so with access to her pipeline. Wolfe nodded slowly. She provided the door. Someone else walked through it. Know who? He tilted his head. I will. And then we set the table. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline, Wolfe had issued his summons, formal, typed, and signed with his full name, an invitation to what he termed a culinary clarification, scheduled for the next evening at 6:15 sharp. The guest list included Veronica K., Marta DeLuca, Rinaldo Marini, and Lowell Trent. Fritz was instructed to prepare nothing. The table was to remain bare save for 4 chairs, 1 decanter of sherry, and Wolfe's unimpressed stare. The flavour of truth, Wolfe told me, requires no garnish. He paced, which for Wolfe meant 3 steps in any direction and a grunt of irritation at having to take them. They will come, he said, not because they respect me, but because they fear I know. And do you? I asked. Not all, he said, but enough. The rest they will provide. You think someone will confess? No, he replied, but someone will deny the wrong thing, and that will suffice. He took his seat again as if settling in for an opera. Truth, Archie, he said, is like sauce. It must be reduced, distilled, and when the last ounce of excess burns off, what remains is inescapable. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Wolfe had moved past investigation and into orchestration. Tomorrow the suspects would sit in his office like spices lined on a shelf, each labelled, each measured, and each subject to heat. And Wolfe, as always, would be the one to turn up the flame. At 6:10 sharp, the bell rang. Fritz opened the door like he was greeting nobility in exile, which, depending on how you viewed our suspects, wasn't far off. By 6:14, the quartet had been seated in Wolfe's office, each occupying their chair like a nervous ambassador summoned to the court of final appeal. Veronica K. arrived first, radiant and remote, with a silk scarf that seemed more like armor than accessory. Lowell Trent followed, briefcase in hand and a tight smile that didn't involve his eyes. Rinaldo Marini entered with his usual blend of sweat and defensiveness, while Marta DeLuca, true to her brand, swept in last, unbothered and unimpressed. Wolfe did not rise. He welcomed them with his usual blend of courtesy and disinterest, offered wine, declined by all but Marta, and gestured to the centre of the desk, where a single spice jar sat on a small linen square like a holy relic. You have all dined, Wolfe said, on mystery. There was a pause long enough for a dozen questions to bloom. You have also dined, he continued, on something far less metaphorical, a pepper blend modified not for flavour but for effect. Veronica stiffened, Marta raised one penciled brow, and Rinaldo fiddled with a cuff button like it might teleport him elsewhere. No charges have been filed, no names yet accused, but the truth, like a well-constructed sauce, has thickened. He leaned back. And now I intend to serve it. That silenced the room more effectively than any gavel could have managed. I took my place by the wall, notepad in hand. I wouldn't need it. I knew this routine well enough to recite in my sleep. This was the part where Wolfe peeled back the layers one by one and left the room sweating by dessert. The pepper, Wolfe began, was no longer simply capsicum. It had become conduit. They blinked. Veronica crossed her legs. Lowell attempted a cough that suggested he'd swallowed something difficult, perhaps pride. Specifically, Wolfe continued, the blend in question contained a derivative compound of solanidine derived from the same family as deadly nightshade, processed into a subclinical alkaloid carrier. I watched Marta glance at Veronica, who was busy not blinking. This compound, Wolfe went on, in low doses causes minor symptoms, confusion, vertigo, gastrointestinal discomfort. In high enough concentration, especially when ingested repeatedly over several days, arrhythmia, seizures, and, in the case of Gianni Corletti, death. "No one meant to kill him," Veronica said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. Wolfe didn't move. She lifted her chin. "They only meant to shake him, slow him down." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Ah, they." Veronica hesitated, then corrected. "I." It wasn't a confession, not entirely, but it was enough to fracture the air. "He'd broken our agreement," she said. "We had an understanding. I was backing the product. Then he tried to cut me out, take it elsewhere." "And so you altered the blend," Wolfe said, "with a compound that would tarnish his credibility without killing him. It was supposed to be harmless." "Nothing masked by rosemary oil ever is," Wolfe said with a grimace. Marta finally spoke. "You used my supply chain." Veronica didn't deny it. "I needed access. You provided it." Rinaldo opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he seemed content to not be the loudest person in the room. The pepper, Wolfe concluded, wasn't poisoned in the traditional sense. It was precisely engineered to harm reputations, delay launches, and maintain control. And then, as it often does when Wolfe finishes talking, the silence filled every corner of the room. Wolfe shifted his weight slightly and gestured to the jar again, as if it were about to deliver the final course. "Each of you had a stake in this matter," he said. "Not just financial, emotional, egotistical. To begin," he turned to Veronica, "you feared loss, not of money, but of relevance. You constructed your career as a palette no one could match. If Corletti succeeded without you, he'd prove you weren't necessary." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "Marta," Wolfe continued, "you needed him silenced, not for theft, but for threat. He'd gone public with claims that you'd replicated his dishes. You couldn't afford the whisper campaign to stick. A failed launch on his part would serve your image better than a lawsuit." She opened her mouth, but Wolfe silenced her with a glance. "Rinaldo," he said, "you wanted ownership. Not just of recipes, but of identity. You weren't satisfied being second in command. You believed yourself the rightful heir to the kitchen and the spice." "That doesn't make me a murderer," Rinaldo muttered. "No," Wolfe said, "it makes you a pawn." He turned back to Veronica. "She saw your ambition, and she used it." Veronica's eyes flickered. "Lowell," Wolfe added, as an afterthought, "you were either complicit or incompetent. If the former, I imagine your books will tell the tale. If the latter, your career is over either way." Lowell had the decency to look ill. Wolfe leaned back. "The motives," he said, "were layered, like a proper reduction. And just as with any fine sauce, it's the balance that determines whether the dish satisfies or kills. I watched the four of them as the final statement settled. No one stood. No one argued. They knew. And Wolfe, as always, had known first. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He never did. He merely leaned forward, pinched the corner of a folded page on his desk, and slid it toward Veronica with a delicacy that made it feel surgical. "This," he said, "was your mistake." Veronica didn't touch the paper. She didn't need to. She'd written it. "Your last review of Corletti's risotto reads like a confessional, not of guilt, but of familiarity. A heat that disorients without overwhelming. A finish like smoke over steel, lingering far longer than flavor should." Wolfe tapped the desk. "That is not a description one invents. It is a memory." "I'm a critic," she said, her voice thin. "It's my job to be vivid." "Vivid, yes," Wolfe said, "but that is chemical memory, not metaphor. That dish was prepared on the final night of Corletti's service. It used the last confirmed jar of the Veritas blend before the batch was removed from circulation." She stared at him, then at the others, then back again. "You wrote that review before the dish was served publicly." Her mouth opened slightly, closed. "I'm sure you convinced yourself it was harmless, that your presence there, your little warning dose, would rattle him, slow the launch, buy you time, but you couldn't resist writing about it. You had to show you'd tasted something no one else had." He leaned back. "And in doing so, you revealed not only access, but intent." There was a pause, long enough to sharpen knives in. Veronica's eyes drifted downward. The silk scarf around her neck now looked less like armor and more like an unraveling disguise. "It wasn't meant to kill him," she said. "No," Wolfe replied. "That's why it did." Veronica's voice was quieter now, less practiced, more human. "He was shutting me out. After everything, I backed him. I gave him every contact, every press angle. Then he met with another distributor behind my back." Wolfe said nothing. Silence was often his most effective blade. "So I altered the blend, a single jar, just enough to throw off the balance, just enough for his test dish to seem off. I wanted him to hesitate, to come back to me." "And instead," Wolfe said, "he double-dosed." She nodded. "He was arrogant. He couldn't resist showcasing it. He didn't realize he'd used too much." "He didn't," Wolfe said. "But you did. You made the compound volatile, stable in small quantities, lethal in concentration." Her fingers toyed with the hem of her sleeve, the first sign of genuine vulnerability since she stepped foot inside. "I didn't mean for him to die." "Intent," Wolfe said, "is a poor seasoning. It does little to disguise the flavor of consequence." Lowell shifted in his seat, but Wolfe ignored him. Marta looked away. Rinaldo stayed frozen. "I didn't know what else to do," Veronica whispered. "That," Wolfe said, "is not my concern." "But the police—" "I'm not the police." She blinked. "Then what—" "I am the wall," Wolfe said, "between scandal and survival." "But only if the House agrees to silence." It was not mercy, not entirely, it was control. And Veronica, to her credit, understood that. "I'll do whatever you ask," she said. He nodded once. The hearing was over. Now came the sentencing. Wolfe's verdict came without gavel or delay. "You will dissolve your holdings in every food enterprise within 90 days. Veronica said nothing. "You will issue no public statement, no tribute, no apology, no farewell column. You will vanish from the gastronomic world like a trace of cumin in boiling broth." Still she said nothing. "And you will provide, via counsel, full restitution to the Corletti estate, no less than the value of the contract you attempted to sabotage." This time she nodded. "That is the cost of remaining outside a prison cell. If you decline, the files go to Inspector Kramer." With annotations, there was nothing theatrical in his voice, no threat, just declaration. And that perhaps was what made it so final. Veronica stood, adjusted her scarf, and walked to the door. Her heels clicked once, twice, then nothing. She did not look back. Rinaldo asked, "That's it?" "For her," Wolfe said. "Yes." "And us?" "That depends," Wolfe murmured, "on whether you continue to meddle in recipes that do not belong to you." Which, knowing Wolfe, was harsher than a sentence with bars. Later that night, after the office had been cleared, the decanter recorked, and the city returned to its usual indifference, I found Wolfe in the dining room. Fritz was setting the table, not because it was time to eat, but because that's what he did when equilibrium returned. "Did you ever taste the blend?" I asked Wolfe. "No." "Not even a pinch?" I trusted Fritz. I glanced at Fritz, who gave a small shrug, as if to say that trust, like seasoning, only mattered when it was applied sparingly and with precision. "He saved your life," I said. "No," Wolfe replied. "He preserved it. There's a difference." Dinner that night was calm. No theatrics, no digressions. Just roast chicken, potatoes, and a sauce Fritz made without a trace of experimentation. As I poured the wine, Wolfe lifted his fork and glanced toward the kitchen. "Exquisite," he said. Fritz, who heard it, said nothing. But he moved a little lighter after that. And me, I just smiled. I'd seen Wolfe praise a roast, but I'd never seen him praise a man. That night, he did both. That evening, Fritz outdid himself, and considering the man has turned veal into art, that's saying something. The dining table was set with precision, the lighting soft, the air fragrant not with adventure, but with thyme and a delicate butter glaze. There was no hint of pepper on the table, not black, white, pink, or Calabrian. Wolfe didn't request it. Fritz didn't offer it. The absence was intentional, and it worked. We dined on poached trout with lemon beurre blanc, a risotto Milanese that whispered rather than shouted, and asparagus so perfectly trimmed that even Wolfe complimented the symmetry. There were no arguments, no deductions, no new suspects or schemes, just the quiet sound of porcelain and silver, and the subdued contentment of a household put back in order. Wolfe didn't speak much, but he didn't scowl either, which in our little world is the equivalent of a standing ovation. After dessert, a tart with a crust so buttery it might have been a crime in itself. Fritz emerged from the kitchen, wiped his hands on a white towel, and simply asked, "Will that do, sir?" Wolfe set down his fork. "Perfectly." Fritz gave a slight nod and retreated. No bow, no fanfare. But I saw it. The smallest lift in his shoulders, as if he'd just won something important. And maybe he had. After the plates had been cleared and the coffee poured, black for Wolfe, cream and sugar for me, he surprised us both. He lifted his cup. "To honest food," he said. "And honest men." I looked up, not because of what he said, but because he said it aloud. "You feeling unwell?" I asked. He gave me a glance that would have curdled milk, but his tone didn't change. "It is no small thing," he said, "to resist tampering with what works." He didn't name Fritz. He didn't need to. That was Wolfe's version of a standing ovation. I raised my own cup. "I'll drink to that." We sat in silence for a moment, and it was a good silence, the kind that follows clarity, not tension. Somewhere beyond the walls the city was still chewing on its own noise, but inside the brownstone balance had been restored, and Wolfe, for all his bluster and blubber, had offered a rare admission that goodness, when it endures, deserves to be tasted and toasted. The next morning brought the Times, and with it the quiet exodus of Veronica K. Her final column had arrived, dressed in polite prose and thin metaphor. Gone were the barbed analogies, the veiled threats, the smug cadences of someone who knew they could shape reputations with a raised eyebrow and a cleverly placed adjective. She wrote about heirloom tomatoes. It was a piece so hollow it made her previous work look like poetry. No bite, no heat, no signature. Wolfe read it without comment. I, on the other hand, couldn't help myself. "She's playing it safe." "She's playing it dead," Wolfe said. I scanned the byline. It had been moved to the bottom of the page. "She's done?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "but she knows it." There was no mention of Corletti, no parting nod to the tragedy, just a bland commentary on seasonal produce. I folded the paper and slid it aside. "Think she'll resurface?" "In another field, perhaps," Wolfe said, "but never in this one." And that, for Wolfe, was a verdict final as flame. That afternoon, as I was filing the last of the spice-labelled evidence into Wolfe's records, or rather pretending to, Saul stopped by. He didn't sit, just handed me a slip of paper. "What's this?" "A chocolatier in Midtown," he said. "One of his sculptures vanished. Mid-delivery, £5 of dark coverture gone without a trace." I raised an eyebrow. "Sabotage?" "Possibly. Wolfe might want to hear it." I nodded, tucked it into my pocket, and watched him leave. When I brought it up over dinner, Wolfe said nothing. But he didn't say no. And that was something. Later that night, I found myself thinking about Fritz's risotto, about Veronica's hollow words and Wolfe's toast. He hadn't praised me, he rarely did, but he'd praised Fritz. And that, I figured, was Wolfe's true philosophy in action. When you find something done right, you don't mess with it, you honor it, which, when you live in a world of altered spices, poisoned ambition, and critics with knives sharper than chefs, is saying something, maybe even everything. As Archie cleared the last of the files and Fritz returned the spice jars to their rightful, non-lethal place, Wolfe remained at his desk, his gaze resting not on the evidence, but on the empty chair once occupied by Veronica K. She misunderstood the seasoning of power, he said quietly. A touch too much, and even brilliance curdles into hubris. He closed the final folder with deliberate finality. And so ends our case, not with a dramatic arrest, but with a quiet retreat from a world where ambition proved more volatile than any pepper. But tell me, what do you think was Veronica's greatest error? Was it underestimating Wolfe, overestimating herself, or perhaps seasoning betrayal with a dash too much pride? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Nero Wolfe stories, served with intellect, intrigue, and just the right amount of bite. Don't forget to share it with a friend who enjoys their mysteries well seasoned. Until next time, watch what you taste and who you trust.